My father called me in tears, swearing that my mother was in the final stages of heart failure and had only hours to live. He begged me not to let my success turn me into a cold-blooded monster who abandoned her family. Guilt-ridden, I drove 3 hours through a blinding snowstorm with $50,000 in cash to save her. But when I arrived unannounced and stepped into the dark house, I didn't find a dying woman. I found a luxury sports car in the garage and a betrayal so twisted it would nearly cost me my life. Thank you for being here. Before I reveal the dark secret hiding in my parents' house, I'd love to know who is watching. Where in the world are you right now? And have you ever had a gut feeling that someone you trusted was lying to you? Let me know in the comments below. Your support truly keeps these stories alive. Now let's go back to that night. The story begins. My name is Valerie. At 40 years old, I had built a reputation in Raleigh as a CEO who didn't make mistakes. I dealt in facts, contracts, and calculated risks. But the one thing I couldn't calculate was the manipulative power of my own father. It was 4:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was preparing for the biggest merger of my career when my phone rang. It was my father. We hadn't spoken properly in 5 years, not since I refused to pay off his gambling debts. But this time his voice wasn't angry. It was broken. "Valerie, it's your mother." He sobbed into the phone. "It's her heart. End-stage failure. The doctor sent her home. She wants to die in her own bed. She's refusing to go back to the hospital." I froze. My mother was only 69. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "Because you're always too busy making money." He snapped, his voice dripping with that familiar venom before softening again. "Don't let your money make you cold-blooded, Val. Don't let her die thinking you hate her. Come home, please. Bring whatever cash you can. The private nurses demand upfront payment." The guilt hit me like a physical blow. Cold-blooded. That word cut deep. I looked at the merger documents on my desk, then at the storm gathering outside the window. I made a choice. I canceled the meeting. I didn't go to a pharmacy. I knew I couldn't get prescription meds without a doctor. Instead, I went to my office safe. I withdrew $50,000 in emergency cash. If my mother was dying, I would buy her the best care money could exist. I grabbed her premium health insurance files, got into my car, and drove into the storm. The drive took 3 hours. The snow in North Carolina can be treacherous, blinding you to the road ahead. But my mind was foggier than the windshield. I was replaying every fight, every missed birthday, feeling the weight of 5 years of silence. I was prepared to apologize. I was prepared to pay for everything. I pulled into the driveway of the suburban villa I had bought for them years ago. It was nearly midnight. The house was completely dark. No porch lights. No movement. Strange, I thought. If she's critical, where are the lights? Where are the nurses? I grabbed the bag of cash and the documents, stepping out into the freezing wind. I decided not to ring the bell and wake them. I walked around to the side garage. The door was broken, stuck halfway open, typical of my father's laziness. I ducked under the door to enter the house through the kitchen. But I stopped dead in my tracks. Parked inside the garage right next to my father's rusted sedan was a brand new cherry red convertible sports car. It was sleek, expensive, and definitely not the kind of car a doctor or a nurse would drive. My heart began to hammer against my ribs louder than the storm outside. Why would a house with a dying woman have a Playboy's car hidden in the garage? And why was there no ambulance? A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't grief. This was something else. I tightened my grip on the bag of money and quietly opened the door to the kitchen. I wasn't just a daughter coming home anymore. I was a witness walking into a crime scene. I eased the heavy oak door shut behind me, the latch clicking with a sound that felt deafening in the silence. I held my breath, waiting for a nurse to shout or for the beep of a heart monitor to echo down the hallway. but the house was devoid of the sterile chemical smell of sickness I had braced myself for. Instead, the air was thick, suffocatingly warm and heavy with the aroma of expensive cigar smoke and the vanilla oak scent of aged bourbon. Soft, low-fidelity jazz drifted from the direction of the sunken living room, a slow, languid saxophone melody that clashed violently with the image of a dying woman I held in my mind. I set the heavy bag of cash and the medical files down on the granite countertop, my movements slow and deliberate. My coat was still dripping freezing water onto the kitchen tiles, but my blood ran cold for a different reason. I crept toward the hallway, staying low behind the kitchen island. The layout of the villa was open concept, but a large decorative divider filled with my mother's collection of porcelain vases separated the dining area from the main living space. It offered the perfect vantage point. I pressed my back against the wall, inching forward until I could see through the gaps in the shelving. The scene before me was not a tragedy. It was a grotesque tableau of indulgence. My mother Martha, the woman who was supposedly gasping for her final breaths, was lounging on the velvet chaise. She wasn't wearing a hospital gown or hooked up to IV drips. She was draped in a crimson silk robe that slid off her shoulders, revealing skin that looked flushed with wine, not pallid with death. She held a crystal goblet of red wine in one hand, swirling it rhythmically. But it was the man at her feet who made my stomach lurch. He was a stranger, young perhaps in his mid-30s, with the slick, polished look of a man who spent more time at the gym than in an office. He sat on the edge of the ottoman, resting my mother's bare foot in his lap, massaging her arch with a slow, intimate familiarity that made me want to look away. This wasn't a doctor examining a patient. It was a lover tending to his mistress. "Is that pressure okay, Martha?" The stranger asked, his voice smooth and syrupy. "Perfect, Lucas. Just perfect." My mother purred, tilting her head back and closing her eyes. I gripped the edge of the wall, my fingernails digging into the plaster. Lucas. Who was this man? And where was my father? I shifted my gaze to the left. Frank was there, sitting in his favorite leather armchair not 5 feet away from them. He was ignoring the fact that a man half his age was caressing his wife. He had a lit cigar clamped between his teeth, the smoke curling up around his reading glasses as he scrutinized a stack of legal documents spread across his lap. He looked like a CEO reviewing a merger, completely detached from the perversion playing out in front of him. The dynamic was terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just an affair my father was tolerating. It was an arrangement he was participating in. Frank flipped a page of the document, the crisp sound cutting through the jazz music. He took a long drag of the cigar and finally looked up, his eyes cold and calculating. "You better make the performance convincing tomorrow," Frank said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "If Valerie walks in here and sees you looking this healthy, the entire plan to get the house back is ruined." My breath hitched. The house. The villa I bought for them. The deed was in my name, but they lived here rent-free. Was that what this was about? Martha laughed, a low, throaty sound that grated against my nerves. She took a sip of wine, looking at Lucas with heavy-lidded eyes before turning her gaze to her husband. "Don't worry, Frank. I know how to handle my daughter," she said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "You know how she is. She is starving for my affection. I just need to moan a little, shed a few tears about how scared I am, and she will hand over her heart and soul just to hear me say, 'I love you.'" Lucas chuckled, squeezing her foot. "She sounds like an easy mark." "The easiest," Frank grunted, circling something on the paper with a red pen. "She thinks she's so smart with her business deals, but she's emotionally stunted. We just need her signature on the medical power of attorney. Once we have control over her decisions, we can leverage the equity in this property and access her liquidity without her ever knowing." I felt the blood drain from my face. They weren't just trying to get the house title. They were planning to entrap me legally. The medical power of attorney Frank mentioned wasn't about making health decisions for a dying mother. They intended to use it to bypass my safeguards. "Make sure you hide the wine before she gets here," Frank added, checking his watch. She's driving through the storm, so we probably have another hour or two. Lucas, you need to be the concerned specialist when she arrives. No slip-ups. I'm always professional, Frank. Lucas replied, finally letting go of my mother's foot, and standing up to pour himself a drink from my father's decanter. He moved around the room as if he owned it, as if he were the son they actually wanted. I stood frozen in the shadows of the kitchen, the $50,000 in cash, feeling like a lead weight in my bag. I had come here ready to mourn, ready to forgive, ready to be the dutiful daughter they claimed I never was. Instead, I was watching the three people I trusted most in the world discuss how to strip mine my life for parts. My mother wasn't dying. She was thriving on my pain. My father wasn't grieving. He was calculating my net worth. And this stranger Lucas was the weapon they had invited into our home to finish the job. I slowly lowered the bag to the floor, careful not to let the zipper jingle. My hands were shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from a rage so pure and hot it nearly blinded me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out before I did something that would ruin the advantage I now had. But as I turned to retreat, Frank spoke again, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper that froze me in place. And remember, Frank said, looking directly at Lucas, once the assets are transferred, we can't have her undoing it. We stick to the second phase of the plan. I didn't know what the second phase was, but the way Lucas smiled, a shark-like baring of teeth, told me that theft was only the beginning. The phrase, second phase, hung in the air like toxic smoke, heavier than the cigar fumes clouding the room. I didn't breathe. My chest felt constricted, as if an invisible hand were crushing my lungs, but my survival instinct, the same cold, hard logic that made me a CEO, kicked into overdrive. I needed proof. I couldn't walk into a police station with just a story about a silk robe and a bottle of wine. I needed a confession. I silently slid my smartphone from my coat pocket, my thumb hovering over the recording app. The decorative divider between the kitchen and the living room was filled with crystal decanters and oversized art books, providing just enough cover. I pressed the red button and angled the microphone toward the conversation that was about to destroy my life. Lucas leaned forward, pouring a generous amount of amber liquid into Frank's glass. The younger man's face lost its playful, seductive edge, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. Let's talk specifics, Frank. Lucas said, his voice dropping lower. I've drafted the documents, but this hinges on her compliance. Are you absolutely certain she'll sign? Valerie isn't stupid. She reads contracts for a living. Frank took the glass, swirling the bourbon before taking a harsh swallow. He looked toward the hallway where they expected me to arrive, his expression twisting into something ugly, a mixture of resentment and entitlement that I had never seen before. She's smart with business, but she's an idiot with family. Frank spat the venom in his tone, making me flinch in the shadows. And don't forget who paid for that education. I created her, Lucas. I paid for the piano lessons, the private tutors, the college tuition. And what did I get? She buys me this house and acts like she's a saint, handing out charity to her poor, washed-up father. He slammed the glass down on the side table, the sound echoing sharply. She walks around with her designer suits and her magazine covers, thinking she's better than me. Frank continued, his voice rising with a jealousy so deep it sounded painful. She thinks she earned it? No. That money belongs to me. It's my return on investment. I'm just taking back what I'm owed. I want her company stripped, I want her accounts drained, and I want my dignity back. I bit my lips so hard I tasted blood. It wasn't just greed. It was hate. My father hated me because I had succeeded where he had failed. All right, calm down. Lucas soothed, though his eyes remained cold. We stick to the script. Tomorrow morning you tell her the heart failure is advanced, but there's an experimental surgery in Zurich. It's the only hope, but it requires an immediate wire transfer of $2 million to secure the spot. And that's where the paperwork comes in, Martha chimed in from the sofa. She had stopped drinking, her eyes bright with anticipation. We tell her she needs to sign the medical release forms for the Swiss doctors, but you slip the general power of attorney into the middle of the stack. Exactly. Lucas nodded. We paginate it so the signature line for the financial control looks like just another HIPAA waiver. She'll be tired, emotional, and desperate to save her mommy. She'll sign without reading the fine print. Once I have that power of attorney, I have legal authority to liquidate her portfolio. The Cayman accounts are ready, Frank asked. Opened and waiting, Lucas confirmed. I can move the liquid assets in 24 hours. We sell the stock options in 48. By the time she realizes the surgery in Zurich is fake, her net worth will be zero. And then, Martha asked, tracing the rim of her glass, what happens when she finds out she's broke? Lucas leaned back, a dark, empty smile spreading across his face. That's the beauty of the insurance policy, Martha. A woman who just lost her mother and her fortune. Well, that's a recipe for a mental breakdown. It won't look suspicious at all when her car goes off the ridge on Blue Ridge Parkway next week. They'll call it a tragedy, born of grief. And the $3 million life insurance policy pays out to the primary beneficiaries. Frank finished, pointing a finger at his own chest. Us. The room fell into a comfortable, self-congratulatory silence. They weren't just planning theft, they were scripting my annihilation. They had monetized my death before I had even walked through the door. My hand shook so violently that the image on my phone screen blurred. I stopped the recording. I had it. I had the conspiracy, the motive, and the method. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to burst into that room and scream to smash the vases, to hurt them the way they were hurting me. But I knew that if I revealed myself now, I would lose. They would destroy the evidence, gaslight me, or worse. Lucas looked strong enough to make sure I never left the house tonight. I needed to be smarter. I needed to be the cold, calculated CEO my father despised. I slowly backed away from the partition, stepping carefully on the balls of my feet. I retreated through the kitchen, the sound of their laughter fading as I reached the back door. The cold night air hit my face, shocking me back to reality. I slipped out, closing the door with the same agonizing slowness I had used to enter. The snow was falling harder now, covering the world in white. I walked toward my car, my legs feeling like lead. At the bottom of the porch steps, I looked down. In my haste to enter earlier, I had dropped the bouquet of expensive white lilies, my mother's favorite, into the snow. I stared at them for a second. They looked pathetic, freezing, and forgotten. I lifted my boot and brought it down hard, crushing the delicate petals into the mud and ice. I ground my heel into them, destroying the last symbol of my love for these people. I got into my car, left the headlights off, and let the vehicle roll down the driveway in neutral until I was out of earshot. Only then did I start the engine. I didn't look back at the house. The daughter who arrived with medicine and hope was gone. The woman driving away was strictly business, and she was preparing for a hostile takeover. The generic roadside hotel was only 20 miles from my parents' villa, but it felt like a different universe. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale cigarettes, a stark contrast to the opulence of the home I had just fled. I didn't unpack. I didn't sleep. I sat at the small wobbly desk with my laptop open and my phone in my hand, channeling every ounce of my professional training. In the boardroom, when a competitor tries a hostile takeover, you don't cry. You audit their books, find their weak points, and crush them. I dialed the number for Vance, a private investigator I had used years ago to vet potential business partners. He was expensive, discreet, and terrifyingly efficient. I gave him 2 names, Frank Miller and the man known only as Lucas. I also gave him the license plate number of the red sports car I had seen in the garage. I need everything. I told him, my voice steady despite the tremors in my hands. Financial history, debts, associates. Dig until you hit bedrock. By the time the sun began to bleed through the thin curtains, painting the room in a sickly gray light, a courier arrived with a secure digital drive. Vance had worked fast. I plugged it into my laptop, and the pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a sickening precision. The first folder was titled Frank Miller. I opened it expecting to see the retirement accounts I had helped him set up. Instead, I found a financial wasteland. My father was broke. Not just cash poor, but catastrophically insolvent. 2 years ago, he had liquidated the portfolio I created for him and poured every cent into high-risk cryptocurrency schemes that had subsequently collapsed. But he hadn't stopped there. The dossier contained photos of him entering an underground gambling den in downtown Raleigh. There were scanned promissory notes to loan Sharks people who didn't sue for payment, but broke legs instead. He owed nearly $400,000 with interest compounding daily. I stared at the screen, realized the depth of his depravity. Frank wasn't just jealous of my success, he was drowning, and I was the life raft he planned to cannibalize. He needed my assets not just to fund a lavish lifestyle, but to keep himself alive. I clicked on the second folder, Lucas Reed. The man massaging my mother's feet wasn't a financial wizard or a specialist doctor. He was a former insurance claims adjuster who had been fired for fraud 3 years prior. That explained the terminology he used. He knew exactly how the death benefit payouts worked and how to navigate the loopholes of a general power of attorney. But the next image made my breath catch in my throat. It was a surveillance photo of Lucas pushing a stroller outside a rundown apartment complex in Fayetteville. Next to him was a tired-looking young woman holding grocery bags. The caption read, Chloe Reed wife. Married 6 years. 1 child. Lucas wasn't a sophisticated lover sweeping my mother off her feet. He was a desperate small-time grifter living a double life. Frank had hired him. My father had found a man desperate enough to do anything for money, instructed him to seduce his own wife to keep her compliant and distracted, and used his insurance knowledge to engineer my murder. The hierarchy of the betrayal was clear. Lucas was the weapon. Martha was the pawn. But Frank was the architect. I closed the laptop, a cold calm settling over me. The daughter who wanted to save her dying mother was dead, killed in that kitchen the night before. In her place sat the CEO, who was about to execute the most ruthless business deal of her life. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the legal documents I had brought with me, the legitimate ones I had intended to use to help them. I tossed them into the trash. Instead, I opened a new document on my computer. I began to draft a revocation of authority. I contacted my personal attorney in New York, instructing him to place an immediate fraud alert on all my accounts. Then I had him draft a dummy document. It looked exactly like a standard general power of attorney, the kind Frank and Lucas wanted me to sign. It had all the correct headers, the legal jargon, and the notary blocks. But buried in the fine print of Clause 14, a section most people skimmed over, was a stipulation that my signature would not authorize a transfer of assets, but would instead trigger an immediate lockdown of the estate and notify the authorities of an attempted breach. I printed the documents on the hotel's portable printer. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked exhausted, pale, and terrified. It was perfect. I didn't need to act like a victim. I just needed to look like a worried daughter who hadn't slept in 24 hours. I gathered my things, picked up the bag of cash which would now serve as bait rather than a gift, and walked out to my car. I was going back to the villa. I was going to drink their tea. I was going to sign their papers, and I was going to let them think they had won. Because the only way to catch predators this hungry was to let them take a bite. I parked my car in the driveway just as the morning sun began to melt the heavy snowdrifts. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. My eyes were genuinely red-rimmed from lack of sleep, my hair was disheveled, and my posture was slumped. I looked like a daughter broken by grief, exactly the victim they were expecting. I took a deep breath, grabbed the bag of cash, now just a prop in my own performance, and walked to the front door. Frank opened it before I could even knock. He was wearing the same clothes as the night before, but his demeanor had shifted from arrogant to frantic. He pulled me into a hug that felt more like a shackle than an embrace. "Valerie, thank God." He breathed, his voice trembling with practiced fear. We thought maybe you weren't coming. I got stuck in the storm." I lied, my voice cracking perfectly. "I came as fast as I could." "How is she?" "Not good," Frank whispered, ushering me inside. "Come. She's waiting for you." He led me down the hallway to the master bedroom. The room had been transformed. The heavy curtains were drawn, blocking out the light. An oxygen tank stood next to the bed, the mask covering my mother's face. Lucas stood by the window wearing a white coat and holding a clipboard, looking every inch the concerned specialist. Martha lay still under the covers, her breathing shallow and ragged. It was a masterful performance. If I hadn't seen her drinking wine and dancing only hours ago, I would have fallen to my knees in despair. But as I approached the bed, I noticed the gauge on the oxygen tank. It was at 0. The tank was empty. She wasn't breathing oxygen. She was just breathing room air through a plastic mask. "Mom," I whispered, kneeling beside the bed. Martha's eyes fluttered open. She reached out, a trembling hand clutching my fingers with surprising strength. "Valerie, my baby. You're here." "I'm here, Mom. I brought the money. I brought everything." Lucas stepped forward, his voice grave. "The cash is helpful for the immediate palliative care, Ms. Miller. But we have a new development. I've been in contact with a cardiac institute in Zurich. They have an experimental valve replacement procedure that could save her. But the window is closing fast." "Zurich?" I asked, widening my eyes. "Can she even travel?" "Medical transport," Lucas said smoothly. "But the institute requires a deposit of $2 million to secure the surgical team, and they need it today." Frank stepped in, playing his part perfectly. He wrung his hands, looking helpless. "Valerie, look at me. I'm an old man. My credit is ruined. The banks won't talk to me. You're the only one with the assets to back this. We need to secure the visa and the funding, but I can't do it alone." He reached into the nightstand and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "I need you to sign as her guarantor," Frank said, his eyes pleading. "It's just standard paperwork for the hospital in Zurich. It allows me to handle the logistics while you focus on being with her. Please, Val, save your mother." I took the clipboard. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking just enough to sell the anxiety. I saw the medical liability waivers, the HIPAA forms, and then buried in the middle the document I had been waiting for. A general power of attorney granting Frank Miller unlimited access to my financial estate. It was bold. It was reckless. It was exactly what I wanted. I hesitated, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room was palpable. I looked at Lucas, then at Frank, then down at my mother, who was watching me through the plastic mask with eyes that were sharp and alert. "Anything for Mom?" I whispered. I took the pen from Frank's hand. I didn't just scribble. I signed my name clearly, deliberately, on the line they pointed to. I pressed down hard, making sure the ink bled through to the next page. Frank let out a breath he had been holding. Lucas allowed a tiny, triumphant smirk to touch his lips. They thought they had just won the lottery. They thought they now owned me. What they didn't know was that at 8 a.m. this morning, my lawyer in New York had filed an irrevocable trust document. My entire liquid estate, every stock, every bond, every cash account had been moved into a locked, protective trust. The moment anyone tried to use that power of attorney to access the funds, it wouldn't just be denied, it would trigger a federal fraud alert. The document I just signed was a tracking device. By the time they tried to move the money, the FBI would be notified of the attempt. I handed the clipboard back to Frank. "Go," I said, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. "Do whatever you need to do to get her to Switzerland." "I'll go to the bank right now," Frank said, clutching the papers to his chest like a holy relic. "Lucas, stay here. Monitor her." Of course, Lucas said. As Frank hurried out of the room, already mentally spending my money, I stayed on my knees beside the bed. I squeezed my mother's hand again. "Don't worry, Mom," I said softly, leaning close to her ear. "Everything is going to be taken care of. You'll get exactly what you deserve." She squeezed back, thinking I was promising salvation. She had no idea I was promising justice. The atmosphere in the house shifted the moment the ink on the contract was dry. Frank didn't hug me again. He didn't thank me. He simply tucked the clipboard under his arm and marched out of the room, his movements sharp and energized. The facade of the terrified husband vanished, replaced by the efficient coldness of a man who had just closed a deal. I stayed with Martha for another hour, listening to her fake labored breathing, holding her hand while my skin crawled. Around noon, the storm outside intensified, whipping snow against the window panes with a violence that rattled the frames. Frank appeared in the doorway, dressed in his heavy winter coat. He didn't look at me. He looked at his watch. "Valerie," he said, his voice clipped. "There's been a change in plans. The specialist from Duke University, Dr. Arrington, is stuck in Asheville due to the blizzard. He can't make it up the mountain. He needs to be picked up at the transit station in Boone." "Boone?" I stood up, frowning. "That's 15 miles away. The roads are covered in ice. Why can't Lucas go?" "Lucas needs to monitor your mother's vitals," Frank snapped. "And I can't drive in this weather. My night vision is shot. You have to go. You're the only one who can navigate the ridge." He tossed a set of keys at me. I caught them reflexively. They were heavy, cold, and familiar. The keys to the family's 10-year-old SUV, a beast of a vehicle. I had bought them years ago for winter driving. "Take the SUV," Frank instructed, turning away to avoid my gaze. "Your rental is a sedan. It'll never make it up the incline with this snow accumulation. The SUV has 4-wheel drive and chains. It's safer." Safer. The word hung in the air, tasting like a lie. I looked at the keys in my hand. Boone was a treacherous drive, even in good weather, winding through the Blue Ridge Mountains with steep drop-offs and no guardrails in certain sections. In a blizzard, it was a death trap. But it wasn't the weather that made my heart race. It was the memory of the financial report Vance had sent me. Frank owed money to people who broke kneecaps. He was desperate. And now that he had the power of attorney, I was worth more dead than alive. "Fine," I said, keeping my face neutral. "I'll go get my coat." I walked to the mudroom, putting on my heavy parka and gloves. I could hear Frank in the kitchen whispering urgently to Lucas. I slipped out the side door into the garage, the wind instantly biting at my exposed skin. The SUV sat in the shadows next to Lucas's red sports car. It looked sturdy, reliable. But as I approached it, a glint of metal on the workbench caught my eye. It was a torque wrench, a tool used for tightening or loosening bolts. It was sitting out, looking clean and recently used, contrasting with the dust that covered the rest of the tools. My stomach dropped. I remembered the conversation I had overheard last night about Phase 2. I didn't get into the car. Instead, I knelt in the freezing slush on the concrete floor. I pulled off my glove and reached for the lug nuts on the front driver's side tire. I gripped one and twisted. It moved. It didn't just move, it spun freely in my hand. I checked the next one. Loose. I scrambled to the rear tire. Loose. I sat back on my heels, the breath knocked out of me. This wasn't a cut brake line that was too obvious, too easily traced by a forensic mechanic. This was insidious. If I had driven this car, the wheels would have held for the first few miles at low speed. But once I hit the highway, once I reached 45 miles per hour on the winding mountain roads, the vibration would have sheared the studs. The wheel would have flown off. I would have lost control on an icy curve and plummeted into the ravine. It would have looked like a tragic accident caused by a blizzard and driver error. A grieving daughter, exhausted and stressed, losing control on a dangerous road. My father hadn't just asked me to run an errand. He had sent me to my execution. Tears finally pricked my eyes, not of sadness, but of a profound, devastating clarity. The man who taught me to ride a bike, who walked me to the bus stop, who sat at the head of the table every Thanksgiving. He was gone. The creature inside the house was a monster who had weighed my life against his gambling debts and decided I was the currency he needed to spend. I stood up, wiping the grease from my hands onto my pants. I wasn't going to Boone. I wasn't going to die today. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police yet. That would be too messy, and I needed the final confrontation to happen on my terms. Instead, I called a local taxi service I knew had heavy-duty winter vehicles. "Pick me up at the service entrance on the main road," I whispered into the phone. "Don't come up the driveway." I left the SUV exactly where it was. I walked out of the garage, leaving the side door slightly ajar so the cold wind would blow in, chilling the house just a little more. I trudged down the long snow-covered driveway to the main road, disappearing into the whiteout. As I waited for the taxi, shivering in the cold, I felt the final tether snap. The daughter was dead. The victim was dead. The woman who climbed into the back of that cab was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. And she was heading back into town to pick up the witnesses for the trial. The headlights of the yellow taxi swept across the front of the villa, illuminating the pristine white snow that hid the corruption rotting inside. I paid the driver and stepped out, carrying 2 heavy bags from a high-end delicatessen and a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir. I walked up the front steps, my boots crunching loudly on the ice, making sure my arrival was impossible to miss. I didn't use my key this time. I rang the doorbell, long and insistent. It took a full minute for the door to open. When it did, Frank stood there, his face draining of color so fast he looked like a ghost. Behind him down the hallway, I saw Lucas freeze in the middle of pouring a drink. They looked like men who had seen a corpse walk out of a grave. "Valerie." Frank stammered, his eyes darting to the driveway behind me, searching for the twisted wreckage of the SUV that wasn't there. You're back already. Where is the car?" "I took a taxi," I said, breezing past him into the foyer, the scent of expensive roast chicken and truffle oil trailing behind me. I started the engine, but the SUV felt loose, unstable. I didn't think it would survive the trip to Boone, so I decided not to risk it. I turned to look at him, my expression pleasant but my eyes dead cold. "You wouldn't want me to get into an accident, would you, Dad?" Frank swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. No, of course not. But the specialist. He canceled." I lied smoothly. "So I decided we should celebrate instead. After all, I signed the papers. Mom is going to get her surgery. That's worth a toast, isn't it?" I marched into the dining room and began unpacking the food. Martha was sitting at the table, wrapped in a blanket, trying to maintain the charade of the invalid, but her eyes were wide with confusion. Lucas was staring at me with the calculating intensity of a predator realizing the prey has changed its behavior. "Sit," I commanded, popping the cork on the wine bottle. "Everyone sit down, I insist." They sat. The tension in the room was suffocating, thicker than the storm outside. I poured 4 glasses of wine, placing them deliberately in front of each of us. I took the seat at the head of the table, my father's usual spot. "To family," I said, raising my glass. "And to getting exactly what we deserve." They murmured weak agreements and drank. I took a sip, then set my glass down with a sharp clink that made Martha jump. "Before we eat," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out a remote control. "I have a surprise. A little home movie I made." "Valerie, we're tired." Martha whined, her voice wavering. "Can't this wait?" "No," I said. "It can't." I pointed the remote at the large flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace. I pressed play. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a movie. It was a grainy, high-definition video taken from the perspective of a smartphone hidden behind a bookshelf. The audio was crystal clear. "She thinks she earned it. No, that money belongs to me. I want her company stripped. I want her accounts drained and I want my dignity back." Frank's voice boomed through the dining room. On screen, he was holding a cigar, his face twisted in hate. In the room, the real Frank went rigid, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The video cut to a new clip. The garage. The lighting was dim, but the figure was unmistakable. Lucas, wearing his designer sweater, kneeling beside the wheel of the SUV with a torque wrench, systematically loosening the lug nuts. Click. Spin. Click. Spin. The sound of my intended murder echoed off the walls. Lucas stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward, crashing onto the floor. You can't. Sit down, Lucas," I roared, slamming my hand on the table. "I am not finished." I stood up and walked to the front door, throwing it wide open. "You can come in now." 3 people stepped out of the snowy darkness. First was Detective Vance, grim-faced and holding a thick file. Behind him were 2 uniformed police officers, and walking between them was a woman with tired eyes and a furious expression holding a stack of photographs. "Who are these people?" Martha shrieked, clutching her chest for real this time. "This," I said, gesturing to the woman, "is Chloe. She's Lucas's wife." Chloe marched into the dining room, ignoring everyone else and walking straight up to Lucas. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She reached into her coat and pulled out a handful of glossy brochures and bank transfer receipts, throwing them into his face. They fluttered down onto the roast chicken like confetti. "You told me you were consulting for a tech firm," Chloe yelled, her voice shaking with rage. "You told me that bonus came from a merger. You bought a Honda Odyssey for me and the kids with stolen money. From her father." She pointed a shaking finger at Frank. Frank looked at the photos on the table, receipts for a minivan, daycare tuition in Fayetteville, and a down payment on a condo. "My money," Frank whispered, his face turning purple. You said you invested it in the Cayman Fund. You said it was safe." "He spent it, Frank," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Every dime you gave him to invest went to supporting his real family. He played you. He's not a financial genius. He's an unemployed claims adjuster." Frank looked at Lucas, betrayal warring with fear in his eyes. But I wasn't done. I turned to the table where the general power of attorney lay still signed. "And as for this," I said, picking up the document, "you thought this was your golden ticket. This morning, my lawyers placed a federal fraud alert on my identity. I moved my entire estate into an irrevocable trust at 8:00 a.m. When I signed this paper, it didn't authorize a transfer. It authorized a trace. The FBI has already flagged the login attempt you made 10 minutes ago from your phone, Lucas." Lucas looked at his phone on the table, realizing he had walked into a digital trap. "But the saddest part," I said, turning finally to my mother. Martha was staring at Lucas, her eyes pleading, begging him to tell her it was a lie, that the connection they shared was real. "He loves me," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "Valerie, you don't understand. We have a connection." "Mom," I said softly, pulling out the final piece of evidence, a transcript of text messages Vance had intercepted. "He doesn't love you. He tolerates you." I read from the paper, my voice steady. "Text from Lucas to Chloe yesterday, 4:00 p.m. Just one more day with the old hag. She smells like stale perfume and desperation. Once we kill the daughter and get the insurance payout, I'm dumping her in a nursing home and coming back to you, baby." The silence that followed was absolute. Martha made a sound that wasn't quite human, a low, keen wail of pure devastation. She looked at Lucas, the man she had danced for, the man she had betrayed her daughter for. He wouldn't even look at her. He was too busy watching the police officers who were now unholstering their handcuffs. Martha collapsed forward onto the table, sobbing into her hands, her silk robe trailing in the gravy. The illusion was shattered. The family was dead. And I stood at the head of the table, the only one left standing. The metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting shut cut through the dining room air, silencing Martha's sobbing. It was a sound of finality, sharper and colder than the wind howling outside. Two officers hauled Lucas to his feet. He didn't fight. The arrogance had drained out of him, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a small-time crook caught in a federal net. He refused to look at Chloe, who stood watching him, with the dry-eyed resolve of a woman who had already mourned her marriage and moved on. Martha was next. When the female officer touched her arm, my mother recoiled as if burned. She looked at me, her mascara running in dark rivets down her cheeks, ruining the silk robe she had worn to seduce a man who despised her. "Valerie, stop them." She whimpered, her voice reverting to the manipulative tone of a helpless child. "I'm your mother. I'm sick. You can't let them take me to jail. I have a heart condition." "You have a heart condition when it suits you, Mom," I said, not moving from my spot at the head of the table. "Tonight you seemed healthy enough to dance." But it was Frank who provided the final ugly crescendo. As the officers pulled him from his chair, his shock mutated into a violent, red-faced indignation. He didn't look at the police. He looked only at me. He didn't see a victim. He saw a rebellious asset that had malfunctioned. "Get your hands off me," Frank bellowed, struggling against the officer's grip. He lunged toward me, only to be restrained. "Valerie, you ungrateful little wretch. I am your father. I gave you life. How dare you? How dare you send your own flesh and blood to prison?" The room seemed to vibrate with his rage. This was the man who had ordered my death because he felt entitled to my success. I walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of him. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked him in the eye, seeing the reflection of my own face, a face he had planned to erase from existence. "You didn't give me life to love me, Frank," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying more weight than his screaming ever could. "You created me as an investment. You thought that because you raised me, you owned me. You thought my success was your dividend. I made you who you are." He spat, spittle flying from his lips. "No," I corrected him. "You made me a survivor. You taught me that the world is full of predators. I just never realized the hungriest ones were sleeping down the hall. Today, I'm not being an ungrateful daughter. I'm being a rational human being. I am returning your freedom to you, inside a cell. You won't have to worry about debts or gambling or pretending to love me anymore. You'll rot in hell for this," he screamed as they dragged him toward the door. "You'll die alone. And this house is mine. You can't take my home." I signaled to Detective Vance. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a large, stiff document, a property deed transfer I had prepared, along with the trust fund paperwork. I held it up so Frank could see it before he was pushed out into the snow. "Actually, about the house," I said, my voice cutting through his tirade. "I'm not selling it, and I'm certainly not keeping it. I've already transferred the title." Frank stopped, struggling for a split second, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You gave it to Lucas." "No," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I donated it. Effective immediately, this villa is the property of the Raleigh Foundation for the Abandoned Elderly. It's going to be a shelter for seniors whose families have cast them aside. It will be a sanctuary for people who actually deserve care." Frank's face went slack. It was the ultimate insult. The symbol of his status, the luxury he wanted to kill me for, would now be used to house the very demographic he despised, the poor and the forgotten. "And here is the best part," I added. "As part of the donation clause, you and Martha are permanently barred from the premises. You will never set foot on this property again, not even as charity cases." Frank let out a guttural roar of despair as the officers finally shoved him through the doorway and into the waiting cruiser. Martha followed, weeping silently now, her head bowed in shame. Lucas was already gone, loaded into a separate vehicle. The front door slammed shut, and silence reclaimed the house. It was over. The music was gone. The smell of cigars lingered faintly, but the draft from the open door was already clearing it out. I looked around the dining room one last time at the uneaten roast chicken, the spilled wine, the scattered photographs of Lucas's double life. It looked like the aftermath of a war, which in a way it was. "Ms. Miller," Detective Vance asked gently, "do you need a ride?" "Yes," I said. "Take me to the airport. I have a company to run." I grabbed my coat and walked out onto the porch. The storm had broken. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world covered in a pristine white blanket. The air was biting cold, sharp, and clean in my lungs. I took a deep breath, exhaling a plume of white mist. For the first time in 5 years, maybe for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the crushing weight of obligation. I didn't feel the need to buy love or earn approval. I walked down the steps past the spot where I had crushed the lilies. They were buried under fresh snow, now invisible. I climbed into the back of Vance's car and looked straight ahead. As we pulled away, leaving the dark, empty villa behind, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I had lost my parents. Yes, but I had saved the only person who mattered, the woman they tried to destroy. The takeaway: thank you for journeying with me through this dark chapter of my life. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this story, it is: this biology is not destiny, and DNA is not a suicide pact. We are taught from a young age that family is everything, that we must honor our parents no matter the cost. But blind loyalty to toxic people is not a virtue, it is a vulnerability. My father mistook my love for weakness and my generosity for an obligation. He believed that because he gave me life, he had the right to take it away financially, emotionally, and literally. Many of you watching might be carrying the heavy burden of filial piety, supporting family members who drain you, manipulate you, or envy you. Let this be your wake-up call. Love should never require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Trust your instincts. If the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones making you feel unsafe, listen to that fear. It might just save your life. Protect your assets, protect your heart, and remember, you have the right to sever ties with anyone who threatens your survival, even if they share your blood. I'm Valerie, and I survived. If you've ever had to make the hard choice to cut off a toxic family member, share your story in the comments. You are not alone. Stay safe and stay strong.